writer should be of as great probity as a priest of God. He is either honest or not, as a woman is chaste or not. And after one piece of dishonest writing, he is never the same again.
This hand wrote the words, describing the world as seen by these eyes, the eyes of Ernest Hemingway. This is Chet Huntley. For the next hour, I shall conduct you in an exploration of the life of Ernest Hemingway, as prepared by NBC News. This program is based upon the results of their exhaustive inquiry. Hemingway emerges as one of the most talented, powerful, and important personalities of this century. He is the most widely read, serious author in the world today, and his work came directly out of the colorful and dangerous life he lived. He pursued experience with vigor and imagination. He gathered the raw material and processed it in his mind and heart. Then he applied to it the precision machinery of his style. The product was, perhaps, the best crafted export we've ever sent abroad to the world, the prose of Ernest Hemingway. His life and his work fed each other. They existed in harmony from his boyhood until his death, and because of this, there is a consistency which invests his work with the quality of genius. He was the figure in whose image nearly all his heroes were made. Nick Adams, the boy in his earliest stories, grew to become Frederick Henry in A Farewell to Arms. He was Jake Barnes in The Sun Also Rises, Robert Jordan in For Whom the Bell Tolls, and grew older to become Colonel Cantwell in Across the River and Into the Trees. In The Old Man and the Sea, the Cuban fisherman was of a different nationality, but he was still a generic Hemingway hero. He lived by the same code. Courage is the major virtue. The most important part of Hemingway's life was spent trying to write prose, as he said, without tricks and without cheating, with nothing that will go bad afterwards. No writer in our times has left a more vivid mark of his talent and personality on the world. Ernest was a half year older than the century, born in Oak Park, Illinois, the second of 6 children of Dr. Clarence Edmonds Hemingway, an obstetrician who loved and was skilled at hunting and fishing, and his wife, the former Grace Hall, who loved music.
I used to play cello. My mother kept me out of school for a whole year to study music, but I was absolutely without talent. Of course, that year I was out doing other things, too.
The best part of the year for him was summer. The family went to northern Michigan, where at the age of 3, Ernest was given his own fishing rod, and at the age of 10, his first shotgun.
The first covey of partridges I ever shot was with my father. We came on them dusting and feeding in the sun beside the grist mill on Horton's Creek in Michigan. I was so excited with the whir of the wings that I missed both shots, while my father, shooting an old lever-action Winchester pump, killed 5 out of the covey. He was a beautiful shot, one of the fastest I've ever seen, but he was too nervous to be a great money shot.
These photographs are advanced 1 generation. They are of Hemingway and his own son. When Hemingway was 14, he asked for boxing lessons. In the first lesson, an ex-pro broke the boy's nose and inflicted what turned out to be a permanent injury to his left eye. But Ernie finished the course and became a first-rate amateur boxer. He thought and wrote often in terms of this sport, and his talent for it was exercised frequently in his life. In the fall of 1913, Ernie went to high school. He was an all-around boy in a classical Midwestern tradition. At Oak Park, he said, if you could play football, you had to play it. He did for 3 years, also managed the track team, competed in swimming, and was captain of the water basketball team. He was a member of the school orchestra for 3 years, played a lead in the senior class play, was editor and reporter for the school paper. He wrote the class prophecy and 24 short stories in his 17th year. He graduated that year at the height of World War I in Europe. It was 1917. President Wilson had coined the phrase, "The world must be made safe for democracy," and the United States declared war on Germany. Ernest tried 12 times to enlist in the Army. His father objected strongly, but he needn't have. The eye injury inflicted in the boxing lessons 3 years earlier caused Ernie's rejection. In September, he got a job as a cub reporter on the Kansas City Star. Short sentences he learned, short paragraphs, vigorous English. He went out chasing ambulances and squad cars and sent back his copy in the genesis of the Hemingway style.
On the Star, you were forced to learn to write a simple declarative sentence. Newspaper work will not harm a young writer if he gets out of it in time.
Hemingway did get out in time. He was watching the ticker as it clicked out that the American Field Service needed ambulance drivers. He volunteered and was assigned to the Red Cross. Less than a month later, he was in Paris, en route to Italy. He arrived during the shelling of Paris by Big Bertha, the most powerful cannon in the world, and went by taxi from the train to the area under bombardment. Danger was a magnet to him. 2 days later, he was off to Milan, near where the Italians, our allies, were fighting the Austrians, and took his place with the ambulance corps. From there, he went to the front.
Having a wonderful time. Had my baptism of fire my first day here when an entire munitions plant exploded. I go to the front tomorrow. Oh boy, glad I'm in it.
This exuberance reminds us that he was 18 years old at the time. He drove his ambulance alongside the sheer cliffs of the Italian Alps, along the hairpin curves. After 10 days, he was bored and itching for action. He persuaded a local commander to allow him to ride down to the trenches on a bicycle loaded with cigarettes, cigars, and candy. He did this for 6 days. On the 7th day, he was hit. A friend of Hemingway's wrote to Hemingway's father.
I've just been to see Ernest at the hospital here. You may be proud of your son's valor. With those in our section, he volunteered to go down to the Piave. It was when the Italians were pushing the Austrians back over the river. About midnight on the 7th day, a trench mortar shell fell within a few feet of Ernest. An Italian soldier was killed instantly, while another soldier lost both legs. A third Italian was wounded badly. After Ernest had regained consciousness, he put the latter on his back and carried him to the first aid dugout. He says he doesn't remember how he got there. Ernest was sent to Milan to the Red Cross hospital. Here he's being showered with attentions by American nurses.
Several years later, Hemingway told a friend of his that he had been in love with a nurse who had left him, hurting him deeply. The physical wounds he had sustained, plus the loss of this woman, left bad scars. It was 10 years before he was able to write about the war. When he did, he wrote very specifically from his own experiences. Many critics regard the book as the finest modern novel America has produced, A Farewell to Arms.
During the time I was writing the first draft, my second son, Patrick, was delivered in Kansas City by cesarean section. And while I was rewriting, my father killed himself in Oak Park, Illinois. I remember all these things happening and all the places we lived in and the fine times and the bad times we had in that year. But much more vividly, I remember living in the book and making up what happened in it each day. Making the country and the people and the things that happened, I was happier than I had ever been before. Each day I read the book through from the beginning to the point where I went on writing, and each day I stopped when I was still going good and when I knew what would happen next. The fact that the book was a tragic one did not make me unhappy, since I believed that life was a tragedy. I knew it could only have one end. But finding you were able to make something up, to create truly enough so that it made you happy to read it, and to do this every day you worked, was something that gave me greater pleasure than any I'd ever known. Beside it, nothing else mattered.
He had learned, and he wrote in A Farewell to Arms, "The world breaks everyone, and afterwards many are strong at the broken places." Thus, from his experience through a period of gestation, during which his brain distilled his experience, to putting his experience down on paper, our inquiry traces the course of his work and reveals that the raw material of life is wrought by this man into art. When Hemingway was released from the hospital, he did the sort of thing which had become a bold figure in the pattern of his life. He put the most powerful stress he could devise upon the part of him he feared might not be able to take the strain. With the scars of his wounds still angry and the pain of his experience still alive in his memory, free to go home, free to go anywhere, he chose to enlist in the Italian infantry. He served with it until the armistice and returned to Oak Park with the Medal of Valor. A friend who knew him then later said, "He came back figuratively as well as literally shot to pieces." He seemed to have a tremendous need to express the things he had felt and seen. Hemingway did indeed give evidence of being troubled in deep and subtle ways. He needed to get away to nature, and he did, to the Michigan woods he had loved as a boy. To keep track of him chronologically, he was still in his 19th year. And for the first time, his life and his work coincide, and he becomes one of his own heroes, the boy the world knows as Nick Adams. The story is Big Two-Hearted River. It tells how Nick, deeply ill in spirit, takes solace from the peace of his solitary camp and the clean pleasure of fishing. The story is put together with the fragility, strength, and perfection of an egg. Nick's sensibilities are so delicately balanced that he dare not make an unpremeditated move lest he jar his mind into a breakdown. Gradually, the peace and harmony of the woods and the therapy of preparing his camp soothe Nick.
Inside the tent, the light came through the brown canvas. It smelled pleasantly of canvas. Already there was something mysterious and homelike. Nick was happy as he crawled inside the tent. He had not been unhappy all day. There had been this to do. Now it was done. He had made his camp. He was settled. Nothing could touch him. It was a good place to camp. He was there in the good place. He was in his home where he had made it.
In 1920, Hemingway met Hadley Richardson and became a reporter on the Toronto Star. Within 2 years, he had convinced the editors of the Star that they needed a roving reporter to cover Europe. He had almost complete freedom of movement and choice of material. There was no better job in the world for him just then. He married Hadley, and they were off to Paris. Hiring Hemingway turned out to be a good move on the part of the Star. The 22-year-old foreign correspondent cabled back sharp, funny, informative, always vigorous pieces.
Paris in the winter is rainy, cold, beautiful, and cheap. It is also noisy, jostly, crowded, and cheap. In some parts, it is lonely, austere, dripping, and cheap. Two of us are living at a comfortable hotel in the Rue Jacob. It is just back of the Academy of the Beaux-Arts and a few minutes' walk from the Tuileries. Our room costs 12 francs a day for two. It is clean, light, well-heated, has hot and cold running water and a bathroom on the same floor. That makes a cost for rent of $30 a month. At the present rate of exchange, on an income of $1,000 a year, one can live comfortably and enjoyably in Paris. Our landlord described it as a third-floor apartment. I was taking a very romantic view of it. Our landlord would probably refer to a villa on the extreme top of Mount Vesuvius as an ideal location, well heated and reached by a pleasant climb, only 28 minutes from the heart of Naples. The scum of Greenwich Village, New York, has been skimmed off and deposited in large ladles full on that section of Paris adjacent to the Café Rotonde, and made the Rotonde the leading Latin Quarter showplace for tourists in search of atmosphere. It is a strange acting and strange-looking breed that crowd the tables of the Café Rotonde. They have all striven so hard for a careless individuality of clothing that they have achieved a sort of uniformity of eccentricity.
He learned to love Paris. It became a city that was home to him as much as any in the world. He learned about painting and met Monet, Braque, Picasso. He met James Joyce. They did a certain amount of drinking together. The author of Ulysses was a small, thin, unathletic man with very bad eyes. When in the course of their drinking he ran into any sort of belligerence, he would jump behind his powerful friend and shout, "Deal with him, Hemingway, deal with him."
Joyce was writing Ulysses. The influence of his work was what changed everything and made it possible for us to break away from the restrictions.
He was introduced by a letter from Sherwood Anderson to the group which gathered around the formidable and brilliant Gertrude Stein. Later, Hemingway wrote to Anderson,
Gertrude Stein and me are just like brothers, and we see a lot of her.
I remember very well the impression I had of Hemingway that first afternoon. He was an extraordinarily good-looking young man, 23 years old, with passionately interested rather than interesting eyes. We spent the evening, and he and Gertrude Stein went over all the writing he had done up to that time. Gertrude Stein rather liked the poems, but the novel she found wanting. There was a great deal of description in this, she said, and not particularly good description. Begin again and concentrate. What a book would be the real story of Ernest Hemingway. Not these he writes, but the confessions of the real Ernest Hemingway. For some years after this, Gertrude Stein and Hemingway did not meet. And then he was back in Paris, telling a number of people how much he wanted to see her. They sat and talked a long time. Finally, she said, "Hemingway, after all, you are 90% Rotarian. Can't you," he said, "make it 80%? "No," she said regretfully, "I can't." However, Gertrude Stein always says, "Yes, I know, but I have a weakness for Hemingway."
Years later, Hemingway replied,
Miss Stein wrote at some length and with considerable inaccuracy about her influence on my work. It was necessary for her to do this after she learned to write dialogue from a book called The Sun Also Rises. I was very fond of her and thought it was splendid she had learned to write conversation. It was no new thing to me to learn from everyone I could, living or dead, and I had no idea it would affect Gertrude Stein so violently. Here it is simpler and better to thank Gertrude for everything I learned from her and to say how fond I was of her.
F. Scott Fitzgerald, the Galahad of American novelists, was in Paris at the time. He was handsome, witty, talented, and successful. He drew the celebrated and the beautiful toward him without effort. He spent his time, his money, and his substance prodigally. Hemingway, his friend, watched without indulgence. The responsibility of talent was work. In a letter to Fitzgerald, Hemingway was harsh.
You put so much damn value on youth, it seems to me you confuse growing up with growing old. Forget your personal tragedy. When you get the damned hurt, use it. Don't cheat with it. You see, Bo, you're not a tragic character. Neither am I. All we are is writers, and what we should do is write. You need discipline in your work. You're a rummy, but you're no more of a rummy than Joyce is, and most good writers are. You're twice as good now as you were at the time you think you were so marvelous. All you need to do is write truly and not care about what the fate of it is.
Using Paris as his base, Hemingway roved Europe for the Toronto Star, eye alert and wit at the ready. At 23, he was a journalist of sharpened discernment with a faculty for seeing through sham and a gift for expressing it so that it crackled.
Mussolini is the biggest bluff in Europe. Get hold of a good photograph of Signor Mussolini sometime and study it. You will see the weakness in his mouth which forces him to scowl that famous Mussolini scowl that is imitated by every 19-year-old fascisto in Italy. Study his genius for clothing small ideas in big words. And then look at his black shirt and his white spats. There is something wrong, even histrionically, with a man who wears white spats with a black shirt.
With the same sardonic perception, the young reporter continued to dispatch his impressions of Europe's political verities.
Queen Marie of Romania, who is a first-rate bridge player, a second-rate poetess, and a very high-grade puller of European political strings, and who uses more makeup than all the rest of the European royal families combined, is making every effort to form such European alliances that the coming disintegration of Romania will be stopped.
His growing sophistication included a knowledge of the cities as well as the people. He was in Berlin at 24 when he wrote,
Berlin is a vulgar, ugly, sullenly dissipated city. After the war, it plunged into an orgy that the Germans called the death dance. There is nothing attractive or gay about the nightlife of Berlin. It is altogether revolting. Cocaine peddlers get short shrift from the Paris police, but in Berlin they sell their wares openly all over the city. In some cafes, cocaine is served at the tables by the waiters. There is no nightclub in Berlin that is not disgusting, dull, and hopeless. If anyone has any doubt that the Germans lost the war and realize that they lost it, all they need would be a session of After Midnight Berlin.
Lincoln Steffens, who met Hemingway at a political conference in Geneva in 1922, wrote about him at the time in his autobiography.
Hemingway was the surest future over there. Walking along the street with him, he would go boxing in the air, fishing, bull baiting, all the motions. In Paris, where they approve all eccentricities, nobody noticed except a smile with this big, handsome boy squaring off to phantom fight you. He was gay, he was sentimental, but he was always at work. Like Sinclair Lewis, like my little boy Pete, he was forever playing what he was writing. And he was straight, hard-boiled, honest, too.
By August 1923, Hemingway had his first book ready for publication, 3 stories and 10 poems. Later, these stories, with revisions, became the nucleus of the Nick Adams stories. His serious writing made him no money, and Hadley was about to have a baby. They decided they owed their child stability, so they returned to Toronto and to a regular weekly salary. This was in August. In October, John Hemingway was born, and by December, his 24-year-old father had reported enough concerts and one-alarm fires to last the rest of his life. The Hemingway family was off for Europe again, and this time to be supported not by a correspondent, but by a writer.